It's about 12 o'clock right now, 12 o'clock Central, my time. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a really great lineup for you today. Um, Ampetu washte, chante washte nape chiuzapiye. Hello, good day. It's good to see all of you again. My name is Deidre Whiteman. I'm the Director of Research and Education here at NABS, and welcome to our webinar. So the purpose of our webinar, the research webinar series from NABS, is to highlight the vital work of researchers dedicated to uncovering the history and lasting impacts of Indian boarding schools, fostering a deeper public understanding and supporting the healing journeys of Native communities through truth-telling and education. And so again, we welcome you to our webinar. A few housekeeping rules. So again, if you can put in the chat box where you're located, we want to see where everyone's tuning in from. And then as we move along, if you have a question, we have a Q&A box located on the lower left side of your screen, or I'm sorry, the lower middle part of your screen. So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter your questions in the question and answer box. And with that, I will turn it over to Charlie and Lacey.
Uju, Makwade Nakas, Makwadoram, Escanaba, and Dochbia. My name is Lacey Kinnart. My native name is Bear-Hearted Woman, and I am from the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Ojibwe Indians from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I am NABS's Oral History Program Operations Manager. I have been with NABS for over 3 years now, a little over 3 years, and it's a blessing to do this work. And now focusing solely on the oral history program, where we travel to at least 20 different states over 2 years or so to interview Indian boarding school survivors to create a permanent oral history collection. And I know there's many survivors on here that have been part of it, as we have already been in Michigan. So miigwech for that. I am a descendant of several boarding school survivors, including my grandma, who is on the next slide. And she went to Holy Childhood School of Jesus, along with my auntie there in the picture with them too. My grandma's passed. She's been gone for 11 years, but we were besties, and she was never able to talk about her experience at boarding school and at Holy Childhood. But Jeannie, she's still with us, and she's involved with NABS, and she now talks about it. So she helps share what she went through and helps our family understand what our relatives went through. And then the other photo is me, my mom, and my gram. That was about a week and a half before my gram passed. So as an only child, I am definitely a mama's girl and a grandma's girl, and this is why I do the work and why I feel blessed to do this work. So miigwech, and I'm passing it on to our other Ojibwe sister, Charlie, and who we help lead the oral history project together.
Awesome. Miigwech, Lacey. Ani bojo indinoe maganadok. Hello, all my relatives. Nimida magizi kwe indigenous. Mako de deman nemamian. Bawating minwan nopaming donjiba. Bawating nada. Hello, my spirit name is Dancing Eagle Woman. I am Bear Clan from my mom's side, and I am from Bawating, also known as the place of the rapids, or Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Nopaming, which is known as Deep in the Woods, or Hessel, Michigan. And so I'm from basically the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm also Sault Ste. Marie Ojibwe, Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, like Lacey, and related to a good chunk of the eastern Upper Peninsula. So that's where I come from, and I still live up here. That's where I'm calling in from today, is Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And I'm happy to be here with you all today. I am the NABS, Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition's Oral History Program Manager. I have been with NABS now since November of 2023, working solely on the Oral History Project. And I am also a descendant of a boarding school survivor. My mom, who is on the next slide here, has gone and attended the Holy Childhood of Jesus School in Harbor Springs. So this is her photo when she was there as a child. And then this is us together more recently. So we have been talking about her story and discussing, we go on road trips fairly often, and that's kind of our thing. And we've talked about her story and her experiences at Holy Childhood now for over 15 years. And so it has been a tremendous journey speaking and sharing with her, and really transformative to see how her story has shifted and her perspective has shifted when she first started talking about it to me and our family 15 years ago to how she shares about it now. And so I'm really looking forward to this presentation today with Eric. We're going to learn a lot of information about Holy Childhood and the impacts and ramifications of Indian boarding school legacy and history in Michigan. And so really looking forward to our discussion today. So miigwech for everybody being here, and miigwech Eric for teaching us and sharing with us today. So that's it. Meet you. Miigwech, 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 miigwech. And so now I'm going to hand it over to our Director of Policy and Advocacy. She's going to share a little bit about the where we're at, where NABS is at with the Senate bill, and then we'll hand it over to Eric. So, Dr. Pankawee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. Suxiardum bon amajid San Lucy Jiction. Nu familia amajid hiham nyachet atum. Nu og inuju wanan sender victors. Good morning from Arizona, everyone. My name is Dr. Pankawee Victors Kozad. I'm from the Thanawatham Nation and the Ponca Tribe of Oklahoma. I currently reside in Norman, Oklahoma, but I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. I am a descendant of boarding school survivors. My great-grandmother attended Chilocco Indian Boarding School, and my great-grandfather attended Haskell back in the boarding school era. And so before I was the policy and advocacy director here at NABS, almost a year now. I was in the state legislature in Kansas, and I served for 12 years there. And so I am still doing policy work, and it's an honor to work with our survivors and with NABS. And so our bill that we have currently working with Congress right now is Senate Bill 761, and that is the number of the bill, and it's a bill to establish the Truth and Healing Commission on the Indian boarding school policies in the United States. Just a little bit about the bill. It is sponsored by Senator Lisa Murkowski. It recently passed the Senate Committee of Indian Affairs last month, so we're awaiting a Senate vote on that. It's currently waiting to be introduced on the House side, and it will be introduced by Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma. And so it is a bipartisan bill, and it's supported by various faith groups, organizations, tribal leaders. So if you're a tribal leader, organization supporter, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And it is going to create a commission to investigate the boarding school era. It's going to locate our Native American children that never came home. It also is going to uplift the voices of our boarding school survivors. It'll make recommendations to Congress, and it will have a final report. So that's a little bit about the bill and what it's going to do. It'll also have an opportunity to locate records to see the true story about what happened to us. And so for more updates or how you can, become involved and be an advocate for the bill, please visit our website and under the advocacy tab, and that will tell you whether, you can write a letter to your congressional leaders, or if you know them, please tell them about Senate Bill 761 to please support that. And like I said, we hope to pass the bill this year. We got close last year. So we've been at this for 5 years. I've been with NABS almost a year. And so we hope to pass it this year because it is a bipartisan bill. And so we hope to keep it that way. We have allies on both sides, on the Republican and Democrat side, that want to see this bill pass. We got close last year. Like I said, it did pass the US Senate last year. But we ran out of time in order for it to pass the House side. It was ready to go. It had passed all the committees. And so we're very hopeful that it'll pass this year. And so, like I said, if you want to get involved, know how you can get involved, please visit our website again. And also, if you would like to make a donation to support our work while we advocate in DC, that's greatly appreciated as well. And so that is my update for the bill. And thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it.
Miigwech Pankali. We know things are a little tough going around right now with Native policies, but we have a really good chance of getting this passed as it's not partisan. We're not a partisan organization, and we're all about truth, justice, and healing, and the truth is the truth, right? So we had a lot of support from Michigan. Jack Bergman actually signed on in support on the last congressional session. So keep calling your senators, your Congress representatives, and make sure that they hear that how important this bill is. At this time, I am now going to introduce our presenter for this webinar, Eric Hemenway. He is a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. He is the Director of Repatriation, Archives, and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Band, and it's a federally recognized tribe in northern Michigan. He has done extensive work with the repatriation of natives and their remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, by working with museums and universities, and has brought between 300 to 400 people back to their homelands. He's a former member of the NAGPRA Review Committee and currently sits on boards for the Michigan Historical Commission, Michigan Historical Society, Michigan Humanities Council, and Little Traverse Conservancy. While we were in Michigan, we also held our oral history project in Little Traverse with the tribe, and Eric was a phenomenal help and really helped us understand the land that we were on, the history of boarding schools, the history of Holy Childhood there. And I personally learned so much. I learned about my family. So as NABS, we welcomed him to the NABS family. And we're forever grateful for the wisdom and knowledge that he shares. So at this time, I'll pass it over to Eric. Thank you so much for being here, Eric, and we look forward to learning from you this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. There we go. Does that look correct? All right. So I want to say miigwech for having me. I'll introduce myself real quickly. Ganebik and Disnakas on Matikamek, Waganuk Donjiba, Anishinaabe Odawa Endau, and Jijik Dodem, Jinagay Archives Records for the Waganuk Odawak, and Gichendum, Tamadoki, and Maminobata Ziwin, and Minjo Minwa Enjinikian, and this Chi Noting Gijigut. So I want to say thank you for being here. My English name is Eric. My Anishinaabe name is Ganebik, the snake, and I am a descendant of Little Traverse Bay Bands. I'm working on my citizenship, Lacey. It's almost there. But as of right now, my legal status is a descendant of Little Tribes Bay Bands. My mom is Peggy Hemenway. It's inevitable that somebody on this call knows my mom. It's just how it works in Indian country. But I am from a place called Cross Village. It's in northern Michigan. And I've been the director of archives for the Little Tribes Bay Band of Odawa Indians for 19, almost 20 years now. And I also want to say I'm very happy to share my work and my life, which are pretty much enmeshed at this point on this very windy day. And being the director of archives, I'm a historian, and I'm going to give everybody my elevator speech really quick, that I collect historical information and curate that information to support the tribal government and its citizens here at LTBB, and to also create historical educational materials, including but not limited to exhibits, curriculums, publications, media, signage, wherever there's story and history, that's where we go. And I never know where the work is going to go at any given time. It just goes. We could be working with a university, a school, public school, a museum, a park, national or state, libraries. But the one consistent is the history and the story. And of all the work that I have done in any form or facet of my life, the most difficult by far has been the boarding school story. And I'm going to share with everybody the program that I've been sharing with other schools, museums, institutions for the last 5 to 8 years. It's grown over time as we've learned more about this story, but this is what I've been sharing with others. And this is more through the lens of Little Travers, because we have 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan, and that's 12 different stories. So I don't want to infringe on anybody else's story, but this is through the work that I've done here at Little Travers. But also I want to acknowledge the other people who have been doing this work for Little Travers, like Ivana Walker-Kijik and Arlene Naganash, who recently walked on, that they, I'm picking up where they left off in a lot of regards. And a lot of people have been doing this work. And first and foremost, I'm not a survivor of the boarding school at Holy Childhood, which we'll get into. I believe my great grandpa was Eli Paul, but I did not go there, and neither did my mom or my grandma. So I'm far removed from it compared to others, but it's definitely impacted, my life. But I think it's impacted every single Native person's life on some level here on Turtle Island. So with that, this is what we will roll out. So in doing this work and educating others, I didn't want to solely focus on the survivors' stories, because that's their story. I really strongly believe that the survivor story should be told with the survivors, through the survivors. And I wanted to contribute to this work in the biggest way possible. So I had to do a little bit of soul searching. Like, how do I do this? Because it's important that people know about, the schools. And I kept getting drawn into the system. What created the schools? The schools did not create themselves. They were created through very intentional and direct actions and means. And so I started to develop my contribution to what created the system, what created the boarding schools. And so in my research, it kept going back in time. I kept having to go back further and further. And the idea of savage, because this is rhetoric and language that is used throughout, whether it's the president or Congress or Senate or priest or teachers who are part of the boarding school system, they use the term savage. And following this really derogatory and hateful word back to contact, when Europeans first landed here, and the idea of civilizing Native peoples began with Europeans in the 1600s. So in my research is like, what created the system? It's this idea that people came here uninvited, and they saw that in their minds we were savages and that they needed to change us immediately. So this idea of change was upon first contact with Europeans, and it just built over time into what we have as a school system. But I think it's really important to understand that the school system started hundreds of years, or the idea of the system started hundreds of years prior to the system actually being created. So the idea of civilizing Native peoples started in the 1600s. Europeans and later American laws, policy, society saw the need, not just the want, but the need to civilize tribal communities. And whether it was the Dutch, French, British, Spanish, didn't matter. All these European people came over here, and they saw that they needed to civilize us. And this will later accumulate into systems created by the American government. Christian denominations were equally invested in the civilization process. It wasn't just government, it was church. And there was no separation of church and state when it came to how Europeans and Americans were going to interact with tribes. There was absolutely no separation. So as soon as, the different denominations landed here, primarily Catholic for us in the Western Great Lakes, they saw that they needed to civilize us. And this just coalesced with what governments were going to do later on. So you have to look at how the churches were laying the groundwork for this work in the United States, whether it's Presbyterian, Catholic, Methodist, so on and so forth. They all saw the need to civilize us. And upon immediate contact with tribes, European and Americans sought to change the tribal populations as much as possible, whether it was their appearance, their religion, their way of life, their communication, education, government, way they use land. Everything about us was subject to change. It just took centuries to get to a point where this change would be inflicted onto Native people with them having little resistance to do this, which is the boarding schools. So I'm big on quotes. I use this a lot when I go into primarily public schools. We do the boarding school lesson plans here in Northern Michigan in 9th grade with U.S. history. And it's encouraging that local teachers are wanting to do this. They see the need to do this. This isn't just a Native story, it's an American story. And going and doing the boarding school lesson with my local teachers, I rely heavily on quotes. And this is a quote from early 1622, and this is from the Declaration of State of Colony and Affairs of Virginia. Because our hands, which have been tied with gentleness and fair usage, are now set at liberty by the treacherous violence of the savages, not untying the knot, but cutting it, so that we who are to have possession of no more ground than their waist and are purchased at a valuable consideration to their own contentment, gain now by the right of war and law of nations, invade the country and destroy them who sought to destroy us. So I want to establish this type of mentality that Native people are having to deal with upon immediate contact in this term of savage. They're not naming the tribes by name or by nation. They're not even using the term Indian in many times. It's the savage. And the view of savage would persist through centuries. And this is evidenced through Reverend James Silkrieg's report to the Commission of Indian Affairs in 1861. So this is literally 200 years past on this continent. And this is what Reverend Silkrieg had to say in Michigan. It's not a vain effort to preach the gospel to men as low and degraded as the savages of our American forests. It is better in reference to this subject to believe and firmly trust in the word of God than to put confidence in promises. So we can see 200 years later, nothing has changed in terms of moving away from the idea that Native people are savages, that this actually has grown over time, this need to change us. And so this is through one of the main primary sources that I use in this work is the Commission of Indian Affairs annual report. This is right straight from, the horse's mouth, essentially, that all these different Indian agents are reporting back to the commissioner, and he's reporting later on to Congress and the president. And these are reports from all across the country. It's just a hard and fast of how they're implementing Indian policy in the United States. And during this time period, there's this large push of civilization to change people. And you can just see the groundwork being laid towards a school system. It's happening over time, over decades, over centuries, but you can see it building towards, something more permanent and widespread throughout the United States. And this is the Declaration of Independence. I know you can't read it, but that's the actual original copy. And so in working with public schools, again, relying heavily on primary sources, and there is no primary source bigger in the United States than the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. This is taught in every single classroom across the country, or it should be at least. And as we're gearing up for the 250th anniversary of the United States, this is going to get more scrutiny than ever in our lifetime, that's for sure. And what does this mean for people? What are the ripple effects? Who is considered in when this document is created? And Native people are mentioned in this document, and it's not in the way most people think that is flattering. And it's the grievances against King George, where the founding fathers, in quotes, are writing, this declaration of their independence. I really don't think it's about Native people's independence, but in the grievances against King George, they're saying he, the king, has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So this is how the founding fathers of the United States are viewing Native people: merciless Indian savage. To me, this sets the tone for a lot of ripple effect actions that would come for the next 2-3 centuries after this. And most people don't know about this passage in the Declaration of Independence. You don't read past the Bill of Rights most of the times. But for Native people, this is a pretty infamous line that is well known. It's on T-shirts now and hoodies, and we know about this. But most non-Native don't know about this. But this term savage, again, is used and to describe Native peoples, but also the creation of policy. So it begins with the founding document, the Declaration of Independence, and it moves from there. July 4th, 1779, during the Revolutionary War: civilization or death to all American savages. And this is what American soldiers are saying after they're destroying villages during the Revolutionary War in Iroquois villages in New York. And George Washington would be known as the town destroyer. And also through Sullivan's campaign in the Revolutionary War, where they were going through, it was a scorched earth campaign against Native people, the Haudenosaunee, in New York. And this is one of the quotes that was captured after their destruction of these villages. And they're not saying Native, Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Mohawk, Oneida, none of this. It's just to all American savages. And it wasn't just a few presidents that were having this sentiment towards Native people. It was many. And this is James Monroe writing to Andrew Jackson in 1817, talking about the hunter or savage state requires a greater extent of territory to sustain it, that is compatible with the progress and just claims of civilized life. It must yield to it. Nothing is more certain than if the Indian tribe do not abandon that state and become civilized, they will decline and become extinct. The hunter state, though maintained by warlike spirits, presents but a feeble resistance to the more dense, compact, and powerful population of civilized man. So I show this to give examples of what tribal nations are going up against. This is from the president, who has immense influence and control and power over populations and money and military at the time, just like today. And that there's this idea that Native people will become extinct. And this feeds into the idea of the vanishing race that would be very well accepted in the early 20th century. But again, savage state. We're not seen as an equal in the eyes of the American populations at this time. Again, this is leading up to the need to change us through a school system. So the school systems, in my mind, are a part of a larger effort to civilize us, the civilization policies. And for our part of the world in the Great Lakes, the War of 1812 was a major event. I argue it was a major event for all of America and all tribal nations. But post-war 1812, tribes in the Great Lakes had to come to terms with the United States forcing these policies onto us. We could no longer take up the war club to defend our land and rights. We had to resort to diplomacy, treaty making, sometimes voluntary removal of going to Canada to avoid removal to the western territories of Kansas and Oklahoma. So it was a very, very tense, difficult time for Native peoples in the Great Lakes. And in many cases, as part of the treaty process, schools were written into these agreements. And I argue that these early treaties that had schools and teachers and schoolhouses were provided by the government, but these weren't Indian boarding schools at the time. And many times the tribes had no say, and not saying that we don't want these schools. The government was going to make tribes accept these schools as part of the civilization process. Tribes realized that they had to adjust in some way, shape, or form to learn English, to read and write, to adapt. But by no means were they giving up, their tribal education, way of life, wholesale at this time. They were accepting this provision within this treaty. So I just want to put that out there, that these early schools weren't technically Indian boarding schools under the treaties. And Thomas McKinney, who's a superintendent of Indian trade, supported this, what we call the factory system. And there's this idea that Native people didn't work, which is ridiculous, that Native people worked very hard to sustain their life for tens of thousands of years on this continent, but it wasn't the work that was deemed righteous or important by American and European societies. So they had this idea that we need to be in like a factory system to produce goods. And this would lead into the first steps of national school systems. So McKinney had this idea that we would make the Indians quote unquote work. And then through that, they would go into Western schools. So this is some of the early foundations of a school system. And he tried to get a bill passed in Congress, but it would fail. But part of that bill would lead into what we call the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. So this is very early in the United States creation that they're starting to earmark federal monies to quote unquote civilize us. So there was a line item in the federal budget in 1819 that says we're going to quote unquote civilize all these savages, whether it's through building churches, building schools, providing farming implements, what the quote unquote the husbandry skills. I mean, a lot of this was wildly misogynist, but the idea that they're going to change us to become civilized starts to take form in the budget, which means that there's going to be staff, appropriations, so on and so forth. So this is from Iowa in 1842. The tribe would not easily be assimilated. Again, this is from the Commission of Indian Affairs annual reports. The operations of the missionaries among the Indians of this agency, I regret to say, hereto have been attended with but little success. It would seem next to impossible to persuade savages to abandon their superstitions and conform themselves to the customs and habits of civilized life. So I read this excerpt in a lot of ways, and one of these ways I read this is that Native people are resisting. They're not giving up. They're keeping their way of life. They're going to do what they've been doing for thousands of years, and good for them. That without them doing that, we wouldn't have what we had today. So the idea of the savage was also in pop culture at the time. It wasn't just the government putting out this rhetoric. It was seen through what people were consuming in their media. And this is from 1874, where Kit Carson, who was essentially like a movie star at the time, very heroic in the minds of a lot of American people on the frontier, this heroic figure. And this is from basically a graphic novel at the time, The Fighting Trapper, Kit Carson to the rescue. And you can see he's killing 2 Native men, one in each hand, because they are so savage, such a threat, such a violent presence on the frontier. And you need somebody like Kit Carson to come and save you. So it wasn't just, what was being put out by the government, it was what was being put out by media. So we have the foundations for the need to change Native people, and now Indian education. And so Indian education, Western education, came with the people who are coming across the ocean. As soon as they landed on these shores, they built churches and then they built schools immediately, one right after the other. Michigan had numerous mission schools, which were adjacent to different denominations. In the 1800s, these schools were operated by different Methodist, Presbyterian, many were Catholic in Michigan. But these mission schools were not federal Indian boarding schools. Some of them would transition into federal boarding schools later in time. But at the beginning, they were not federal boarding schools, they were mission schools. And oftentimes the local tribe worked jointly with the priests and nuns to ensure the schools worked. And children were sent there by consent of their families, which is a big shift from federal schools. Now, not every Native person sent their kid to these schools. Not every person was supportive of these schools, but they were a presence in at least our communities in northern Michigan, and I think in many other Native communities, these mission schools. And some of these schools had very low attendance, maybe 10, 20 people. Some did live there year round, but many times they were built by the local Native communities. They brought food, firewood, and so on and so forth. But I also saw this as a tool at the time, especially in the early 1800s, where they needed to learn how to read and write to adjust to these very quick changes happening in their communities, especially with treaty negotiations. So having these kids educated to at least learn how to read and write and communicate was very effective, at least for our community, in avoiding removal out west. So government schools for Indians in Michigan were small. There was a government school in Bay Mills and one in Middle Village, also known as Goodhart. Bay Mills is the Upper Peninsula, and Middle Village is the Lower Peninsula, the northern portion, I should say, of the Lower Peninsula. So this is one of our oldest images of the mission school that was become the Federal Boarding School of Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian School. It is right downtown Harbor Springs. This is an old postcard. And the church is on the left, obviously, and on the right is the old school. It was a very simple building, just 2 rooms, and it would grow over time. So this lands us into the federal Indian boarding school. So by the late 1870s, the United States was overviewing its operations and handlings with Native people, and it deemed that it was failing in its efforts to quote unquote civilize us. So the logical step in terms in the thinking of the federal government was we need to create a school system and we need to start to get kids out of their homes, out of their communities, and indoctrinate them and civilize them in a controlled environment. So the government started to take a very direct and immediate action in doing this. And this is from Hiram Price. He's the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in his annual report of 1881. This is a few years after Carlisle was up and running. I believe Carlisle started in 1879. It is claimed and admitted by all that the great object of the government is to civilize the Indians and render them such assistance in kind and degree as will make them self-supporting. And I think no one will deny that one part of our policy is calculated to produce the very opposite result. It must be apparent to the most casual observer that the system of gathering the Indians in bands or tribes on a reservation and carrying to them victual and clothes, thus relieving them of the necessity of labor, never can civilize them. Labor is an essential element in producing civilization. If white men were treated as we treat the Indians, the result would certainly be a race of worthless vagabonds. The great kindness the government can bestow upon the Indians is to teach him to labor for his own support, thus developing his true manhood, and as a consequence, making him self-reliant and self-supporting. This goes on for pages. There's a lot to read from this, that the idea is that natives cannot take care of themselves, they don't know what labor is. We're in this state of needing the federal government in order to go forward as a people. And nothing could be further from the truth. But this is, I think, important to understand and to see, even though it's very difficult to read and hear this, but this is what creates the system, is this mentality that these people cannot support themselves. We're in a state of dependence on them as Native people. So I think it's very important to show these examples from the federal government, because again, the schools did not build themselves. There would be over 400 of these schools across the country. How did this start? Where did it come from? What gave the support and the money to do this over a century? This is the type of rhetoric and mindset that do this. And this is all coming from a very public source. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs annual report. The University of Wisconsin has digitized all them, so you can go there. Download them now while you can, and you can read for yourself. So by the 1880s, the decision was made to create and fund federal Indian boarding schools, not just in one or two states across the country. The groundwork we see has been laid in previous centuries. I got to update this because now there's more information being found. There'd be over 400 of these schools across the United States. And some of these schools were operated by the federal government, but many were run by Christian churches that received federal funds. The first and largest school was, of course, Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. That ran for an average time, 1879 and 1918. Founded by Richard Pratt, has become notorious at this time in his vision of the schools and how he operated them. And again, from a Michigan perspective, thousands of Native children from across the country attended these schools, including Anishinaabe from Michigan. So this is just for our community of Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa. This number will certainly grow as I go through and do more research, but as of right now, this is what I have where our people went to: Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian Boarding School, Harbor Springs, Carlisle, Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School, Mount Pleasant, Michigan, Toma, Haskell, Genoa, and Chilocco. Oh, and then also in Hampton, Virginia, that's one I have to add. We just found out that there was one Odawa by the family name of King who went to that school as well. So this list will grow over time, but this is what we know of who went from our community to these different boarding schools across the country. And I do not know at this point how they ended up at these various schools. What made one family decide that they're going to go to Genoa and Haskell? But I'm also seeing a lot of kids transfer from school to school to school. They would start out at Holy Childhood, then transfer to Carlisle, and then maybe go from Carlisle to Mount Pleasant or vice versa. Some runaways were very common, which we'll look at in a few slides here. But I don't have the formula for how families decided where they were going to send their kids. It's just not there yet, at least for me personally. So I'm very lucky to work where I'm working at Little Tribes Bay Bands, but I also am very lucky that we have a GIS department. We have a map department, so that's pretty cool. And I asked very nicely to the guys, hey, can you make me a map? Here's the data. And so we've made this map of Indian boarding schools with LTBB attendance. And this is a lot easier at times when we're doing these type of programs in the public schools for our 9th and 10th grade, U.S. history students, civic students, government. Indian boarding schools can fit into all of these disciplines in the public schools. So I've been teaching this, or helping teach it, I should say, at our public schools, but also at universities and community college and libraries all over, wherever the story will be heard. Having a map can cover so much ground. It just shows the sheer breadth of where people were going in the late 1800s or early 1900s. I mean, they're getting on trains. The trip itself is long, it's difficult. And they're at these schools sometimes for years. Sometimes they come home in the summer, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're there for a year, sometimes they're there for 6 or 7 years. It all depends on the individual. But you can just see from our community at Little Traverse, they're spread out all over the Midwest. And again, I don't know how they ended up at all of these schools. So I worked with the University of Michigan on a literacy project several years ago. And within about 5 minutes, it turned into a boarding school project, because we were looking at what is the literacy rate of Odawa students in the early 20th century. And we were looking at where the students were, and they're all at boarding schools. So we went through and we looked at the attendance record of between 1889 and 1931 at the three main boarding schools for us at Little Traverse, population-wise, which is the Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian Boarding School, the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School, and Carlisle. And Carlisle is by far, the lowest number. Holy Childhood they hit 200 in 1928 or 31, well over 100 for that duration. And in comparison, our tribal population at this time at Little Traverse Bay Bands is roughly between 3,000 and 4,000. And so this is all of our kids are at these schools. So Mount Pleasant, it spikes pretty big in 1904, over 100. But the lion's share of kids are going to Holy Child because it's in our backyard. It's right in the middle of our reservation. It can house up to 200 kids. And this was a very familiar institution for a lot of Odawa people in northern Michigan at the time. Some kids did go to Carlisle, of course, but these mostly Mount Pleasant and Holy Childhood. So we wanted to show, okay, there's the boarding schools, and then what about our public schools? There had to have been some Odawa kids going to the two main high schools within Emmett County, within our reservation, and that's Petoskey and Harbor Springs. So I went through all of the graduation yearbooks from Harbor Springs to Petoskey between 1887, and let me adjust this here, 1949. And I fully admit there's going to be some errors, there's going to be some families that I miss, so on and so forth, but feel pretty confident I got most of everybody. And I was pretty shocked to see just the extremely low numbers of graduates at these two publics. I graduated from Harbor Springs in 1995. So I know Native people were there. And to look back in time to see that there was very, very low numbers of Native people at these schools who are graduating is just confirms where they were at. They were here. They're at the boarding schools. So all of our kids are going to these boarding schools. Very low numbers of graduates at the public schools. And then the question, why weren't they at the public schools? And in the early 1900s, there was a tuition at Harbor Springs of $25 to go to the school, which was, big money in the early 20th century. And then going through and doing this work, I found this brochure for a train company that was, selling northern Michigan, basically, like getting people on the train, come up north from Cincinnati, St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, come to this, beautiful place, clean air, clean water, so on and so forth. And when you get to this place called Harbor Springs, here are the tourist attractions. And one of the tourist attractions on this brochure for this train company was the Indian Boarding School of Holy Childhood. And within the brochure itself, it says, these inmates are not welcomed at the public schools. That's how they're labeling these kids at Holy Childhood. And the fact that this brochure is saying that they're just not welcomed, like this open discrimination of Native peoples at this school in our heart of our reservation. So this puts a big piece to the puzzle for me. Like what's keeping these kids from going to this school? They're just not welcome. So sometimes there's big discrepancies in attendance and enrollment, but not at Holy Childhood. They are almost identical with it when they have the attendance and the enrollment, that these kids were there. So that's what this chart represents. And again, this is out of our literacy project with U of M. And can't tell the story without having some people, and nothing represents that, I think, better than the images. And this makes it real for a lot of students that we work with, and public in general, that these aren't numbers, these are families, these are kids. They're from all over the country. And this is one of the most infamous photos for all Indian boarding schools. It's Carlisle. And within this image, there are Odawas from Northern Michigan, but I can't pick them out. And that's by design. You know, everybody has a uniform. The girls have their hair cut. Everybody's supposed to look the same. And within this are people, just like people from all over the country, including Alaska and out west. They're all coming to Carlisle. It's the biggest, most prestigious school at the time. And it doesn't run that long compared to, we're going to say, at another school from Michigan, but we definitely had our students there. But I was going through, and all of the records for Carlisle have been digitized through Dickinson University. So I was going through and wanted to show something for our students who are 14 and 15 years old. And this image just really jumped out for me. It's a young girl from the Plains. I forget what tribe she's from. I think it's either Cheyenne, Arapaho, or Lakota. She's a Plains tribe. But she just has a really distinct look. She really just spoke to me. And it's a young girl. I mean, we can all relate to, you know, this is a person. She's identifiable as a human. And she has a very distinct look. She has a very distinct dress. She just has this gaze that just really captured me. And so we showed these to the students. And then 1 year later, we show, you know, the after. You know, can you find this girl? Where is she? This is with her and her cohorts, her friends, her chums. And this is one of these, you know, examinations of the records where students can really dig in and they can see this. And sometimes they can pick her out, sometimes they can't. But this gives it a face. This gives us a real feeling that these are people and these are kids. And, you know, how impactful this change can be and how quick. While she's not Odawa, she is Native, but she's representative of all these different people from all over the continent, you know, going through this, including Canada. But then we pull it back home. And this is Susie Fisher. She's from Bay Shore. She's part of Little Tribes Bay Bands, Waganuxing. Bay Shore is also called Agaming across the bay, across Little Traverse. It's one of the 9 bands of Little Tribes Bay Bands of Odawa. So very local, very much Odawa. But then we show this is one of ours. This isn't just this random Indian. This isn't just a savage. This is a person who has a name. The family's still with us at Little Traverse. They're still Fishers. And she's a real person. I don't know her experience. I don't know what happened to her after the school, but we do know she was there. And this is her. And this is Isaac Willis. He's from Charlevoix, Jinwakizibi, Pine River, one of the 9 bands of Little Traverse. Isaac was at Carlisle. Obviously, he joined the Navy afterwards, like many people did who went to boarding schools. They went and fought World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I mean, we know that the high number and percentage of Native people in the armed forces, a lot of young boys, young men were transitioning from the schools into the armed services. And Isaac, I believe, fought in World War I. And the Willis family is still very much a family here at Little Traverse. We have there's a direct connection to this for many people with this image, just to show that this is just a random person. This is part of somebody's family. We do know Isaac did go in the military, came back, and he was a carpenter up here in Northern Michigan. And these are all from the records that were digitized by Dickinson University through a Mellon grant. So the Carlisle records are like unlike anything, where somebody took the time and the money to digitize all of them. So there's only one Carlisle that has that collection. Not every school has all their records digitized. Just want to put that out there. So Mount Pleasant Indian Boarding School. And we had a large number of our students from 1893 to 1934 from Little Traverse go to this school, and it's in the middle of the state. A lot of other kids from other portions of the state went to the school as well. I just wanted, to focus on the Little Traverse story because that's where I'm at. And within this photo, it's a very striking photo of all these kids in line. This is at the Library of Congress. This photo is from. And without a doubt, there are Little Traverse kids from Cross Village, Harbor Springs, Charlevoix, Beaver Islands, so on and so forth, as part of the Mount Pleasant school. And sports are a big part of the story of boarding schools, but it kind of convolutes things at times. It muddies the water, I find, because when I do these programs, especially public programs at libraries and museums and so on, the story of Jim Thorpe is always brought up. Look at Jim Thorpe, the great things Jim did. Well, yeah, Jim is kind of the 1%er of Indians. I mean, he's a phenomenal athlete. He did things nobody could do, and he became the celebrity, the star in the football field, in the Olympics, track and field. His experience didn't reflect the vast majority of Native people at these schools. And that also takes away from what the purpose of these schools was to forcefully assimilate and change us and to be a non-Native. So that story of Jim and the celebrity and being a star, that kind of muddies the water for some people about Indian boarding schools. But sports were a part of the schools. Without a doubt, there was camaraderie. It was an outlet. People had friendships. It was a good thing overall. But again, I don't want to stray away from the fact that these schools were there to change us. And there had detrimental effects and very negative effects on a very large number of Native people. So, but I want to try to be a good historian and say this is part of the story with the schools. So a lot of the work that we do is to find primary sources through local newspapers. So I'm always mining, looking at newspapers. Sometimes people are very generous. Say, hey, Eric, I found this newspaper clipping. What do you think? I'm like, thank you very much. And this is a very powerful one. This girl's like, I've had enough of this. I'm setting the place on fire. And she, I think, tried to do this several times. So this goes to show that there was resistance. This is a pretty extreme resistance. I'm not condoning arson whatsoever. But what's the story behind this? What drove this 16-year-old girl to try to set the building on fire? There's a story behind this. It wasn't just, I don't think, a simple act of rebellion, that something's happening and she's pushing back on it. And this girl is older too. She's one of the old, she would be considered an old girl, older student at the time. So these newspaper articles are incredibly valuable of showing, this perspective, which isn't always easy to find within the records. It's easier to find within the testimonies of the people, for sure. But in the public records, these primary sources, it can be difficult. But something like this, I think, is, to me, it's archival gold. Then there's also very difficult ones to read. And this is from the Mount Pleasant Indian Boarding School, probably obviously pre-1934, 1933, before the school closed. Little Red Runaway. So the titles are often racist at this time. That's just how newspapers operated. 8 years old, this boy wanted to go home, and he ran away. They call sometimes they call them walkaways, but they're runaways. And for those of you not familiar with the geography of Michigan, Harbor Springs and Mount Pleasant is separated by at least 150 miles. It takes me about 2 hours to drive down to Mount Pleasant going 80 miles per hour. This young guy is deciding he's going to walk home, run away in November in Michigan. This is winter, essentially, that this little guy is going to make a run for it. Again, what's the story behind this? What's pushing this kid to essentially risk his life to return home? This isn't, to me, just a simple case of being homesick, which he is, without a doubt. He's young. He may have been there since he was 5 or 6 years old. And that was a goal of these schools, was to grab these kids as early as possible in these really core fundamental years of language, culture, just they're formulating who they are. You can't replicate this time in life. That was the goal of these schools, was to get kids at a very young age. This kid wanted to go back. So this was a really hard one. They capture him, return him back, which they would do with these kids. But he's remembered in the records. And we showed this to show that even we have this girl that's 16, acting out, but then this young boy who just wants to get home. So now we get to something very personal for me, and this is the Holy Child of Jesus Indian Boarding School. It ran from 1886 to 1983. This is one of the last schools to close in the country, if not the last. Run by the Catholic Church in its entirety, by the Sisters of Notre Dame and the Franciscan Friars. Holy Childhood was like any other place that I've seen personally and in the records. One of the reasons it's unlike any other is we have this high number of survivors who are still with us today who went to the school because it ran so late. And so this has been the main focus of my research for the last 5 years, even before the investigation kicked off with the interior. It's like, we need to know what happened with this place. And by far, this has been the most difficult research work I've done personally and professionally in my life. I did work under NAGPRA of repatriation, returning human remains, which was very heavy. But this is different, and for a lot of different reasons. And this photo is difficult. And we got this photo from a private donor, and it's been hard to get records from the Catholic Church. It's been hard to get records on Holy Childhood. We had a private donor come in and letting us copy his collection. And this photo, 1890, and these kids in the front aren't looking up, heads down. Girls got their heads shaved. There's no smiles. There's no sense of happiness. There's no glee. There's just this downtrodden, just defeated sense in this photo. And these boys and these girls in the front, they're young. They're probably 4 or 5 years old. And we've seen within our records that we've gotten from Marquette University that some of these kids were as young as 4 years old at Holy Childhood. And some of these kids would stay for 8, 10 years. Some would go home during the summer, some wouldn't. Some would go home during the day. They're called day students. And then some would be boarders, and they lived at the school. So there was day students, boarders, and there was also non-native students at Holy Childhood. And that's a part of the story that I came to realize more and more doing the work, that there were these white students who were day students, but they were never boarders. And talking with some of the day students who are survivors in their own right, because they witnessed this stuff and they got smacked around and beat, but not like the Indians. They would say that, like, you know, the nun so-and-so would hit me, but she would beat him. And they would differentiate between the punishments. Like, I would get smacked around, but not beaten. I would get hit, but I wouldn't get beaten. So the way they're recollecting their experience is very telling. But there were some white students throughout the existence of Holy Childhood, but never boarders. So this photo is very haunting in a lot of ways, because this also tells me about there's been multiple discoveries of burials around Holy Childhood over the last 100 years. And this photo is very haunting for myself because I was part of a recovery in 2011 where a local surveyor was doing some road work in front of the school. They were repaving it, and I got a call from the surveyor, and he said, "Eric, you need to come down here immediately. We're in front of Holy Childhood. I think we found a burial." So I went down there immediately, and they discovered a mass burial, not just 1 or 2 people. It was an unknown number, at least a dozen, in the middle of the road underneath the sidewalk. He said, "Eric, I think this is from the school." And I think, yeah, I think so too. Look with the location, and I'm not an osteologist or a forensic expert, but these are all really small people. They're kids. And like, where are the police? You find bodies, you call the police. You find a finger or a rib that's human, you call the police. And he said, "They're not coming down today. They're not coming down tomorrow. We have our orders to pave this road in 48 hours. And you have to recover what you can in 48 hours, and then we're going to pave it." And we were left with that. And so we went through, recovered who we could in those 48 hours, and the city did what said it was going to do, and they repaved the road. So half of these kids are still under the road, under the sidewalk, I should say. And while this was my experience, it made me think about what other experiences for the 400 other schools across the country. This isn't going to be a one-off. This isn't just us. This is also in Canada. This is going to be all across Indian country where these, discoveries are going to be made. So that's part of the story. Wherever these schools are, there's going to be a high likelihood of children being there still. and getting those records. And I understand there was diseases and epidemics that went through. Maybe it's measles, smallpox, I don't know. We need to know, how did these kids pass? What are the circumstances, for closure within our communities and so on and so forth. So that's part of the story, probably the most difficult for me. So with Holy Childhood, it ran very late. And like I said, I use this photo just to show how young some of these kids were. Without a doubt, this is one of those 4 or 5-year-old kids. And for Holy Childhood, it stopped receiving federal funding in the 1920s. And then from 1920 roughly until the 1970s, they were operating on their own with donations. So they would have fundraisers, dinners. The local resort communities would have what they called talent shows or fashion shows. They would just give money to the school. People drop off food, clothing, whatever. But a lot of times they would have these events and they would dress the kids up as Indian on the weekends and they, raise some money. But then during the weekday, you're not to be Indian. It's only for these special occasions. So this was going on the whole time at Holy Childhood to raise money. And kids did run. They ran from Holy Childhood. So this is 1940. And this is a difficult one as well. These 2 boys ran and they were 13 years old and they were running to go home to the Upper Peninsula. And they were going to a place called Munising, which is about at least 100 miles from Harbor Springs. And they ran in February. And February 1940 is not February of 2025. Brutally cold, lots of snow, lots of wind, blizzard conditions. And one of the boys did not make it. He got to a place called Sturgeon Bay, just north of Cross Village, and he froze to death. And his buddy had to go back to Cross Village and notify the families and go recover his friend. So again, what drove this person, this child, essentially, to leave in these conditions in February? Probably just had a wool coat, didn't have Gore-Tex and big fancy boots. They just wanted to get home. So there's a story there. And this is part of the story, that these kids were running. And this isn't, Oklahoma, this isn't New York, this isn't Arizona, this is our own backyard of northern Michigan. So we're not neglecting our own community. We want to tell our community story first and then branch out from there to show the commonality with other communities. But yeah, this family's still with us today, the DuVerneys. It's a big family in Little Traverse. So this is the school itself at its height, the Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian Boarding School in Harbor Springs. This photo is circa 1930s, I believe. And this is at its height. It's when it was at its biggest. The school is the red brick building in the middle. And on either side is the girls' dormitories and the boys' dormitories. And the church is still there to this very day. So it was the largest structure in Harbor Springs. You couldn't miss it. Everybody knew about this school, but nobody knew really what was going on in the school, I think. When the story started to break locally in our non-native community, people were asking a lot of questions like, why didn't people talk to people? How come nobody knew what's going on? And so we had to educate, that portion of our community, about what was happening. These are kids. They're not going to tell people. A lot of times they didn't tell anybody for years and so on and so forth. But everybody knew the school. Everybody knew what the building was. So this is a photo we got it's from 1955 from a private collection. Again, this is hard information to get through these Catholic schools. This is from a local guy. His mom was a reporter who covered the tribe in the 1940s and 50s, and he gave us all of her original photos. One of our best collections. This photo is very haunting. I don't use it as much anymore. And this is Arrival, 1955. The school in the Upper Peninsula at Baraga closed, I believe, in 54 or 55, up by Kinnart Bay, Holy Name of Jesus. When that school closed, they started to ship a lot of those kids down here. And a lot of this was through social services, and you started to see the state get more involved through foster homes and so on and so forth. So that becomes more of a story in the mid-20th century. So the school closes up in the Upper Peninsula. They're sending all these kids down to Holy Childhood. And this is literally the day they arrive to this Holy Childhood. And I was showing this photo to a colleague who's from that community up in the Upper Peninsula. And I said, hey, I know your dad went there. I think this photo will have some value for you. I sent her the photo. 10 minutes later, she emailed back. She said, I've been crying ever since because my dad is in that photo. And when she said that, I identified him immediately. I was like, of course. She goes, once he walked through that door, literally 10 seconds after that photo is taken, everything changes for him. It's a very powerful photo. Like I said, I don't use it as much because I don't know who's alive in that photo anymore. And I want to be respectful. But just to show how late this goes on in our community in northern Michigan. 1950s, most schools are closed by then. But this one's still going pretty strong. In the 1950s, they have at least 100 kids boarding at the school. They're living there. And that's not including day students. So just on donations alone, they're still going. And these kids they're there for the long haul. They got their beat up suitcases, their boxes. They're going to be there for years. And like I said, I don't use this one too often, just because. So the school comes down in 2006. And this is a photo we took of the school being demolished. There was a lot of debate within the community here. Should the school stay up or should it come down? I just started my job at that time, 2006. I'm totally green, rookie, but I know this is a big deal. So I was there for this whole proceeding. And they had one last walkthrough. And that was very telling. Some people came there who hadn't been there for years, decades. They didn't want to go in. Some went through and they told their stories. Some would see a certain thing, a place, a sink, a closet, a door, and they would stop and start telling stories or not tell a story at all. And half the community was, we need to keep this up because it reminds people of what happened. And the other half was like, no, we need to tear it down because it's a trigger. And they're both right. It's an impossible scenario. Ultimately, the church made the decision to tear the school down. It's a blighted, dilapidated property. They said it would take millions of dollars to restore it. So they tore it down. And in its place, they built a community center. Before they tore the building down, the school itself, there on the outside, on the grounds, there was a state historic marker that said this was an Indian boarding school. And when they tore the building down, they took the state marker down with it. So if you walk by there today, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this was a place of one of the last Indian boarding schools in the country, which it's a shame. That's a disservice. They should have something that says this stood here, at least some type of marker, but there isn't. So this is from our local newspaper. And no, it's not just a memory. This is a legacy in a lot of regards, and not a good one for not just our community at Little Traverse, people from the Upper Peninsula. There's people from Grand Traverse. There's people from Mount Pleasant. There's people from all over the Great Lakes that went to this place, but primarily they were from northern Michigan. So I disagree with this title. It's not just a memory. So the lasting effects of these schools. The hard and fast, there's a loss of language, history, custom, culture. A lot of kids never made it back. The abuse that is suffered at these schools that we're learning more and more through, the testimonies of survivors coming forward. And then this lack of awareness has happened in this country. It's created a lot of misunderstandings and stereotypes I'm seeing within our neighbors that are not Native. And the burials of these children at these schools in the United States and Canada, I think it's just this story's not going away. The story's going to come out more and more and more as this work continues. And this is from the local newspaper about that day where they found the bodies, and it's buried within the article, and it just says bones discovered during Main Street construction. That's it. It's not the title, doesn't go into depth about this. And this is one of the only pieces of public evidence that this thing happened, was this really short blurb in the local newspaper. And if you read the newspaper article, it's completely erroneous, where the town manager, mayor guy says, we worked with the tribe, we did the right thing, and we handled it correctly. No, you didn't. You didn't call the police. You didn't stop construction. You tried to get this done as soon as possible. But at least this shows that this did happen. So one piece of evidence, not the best. So after, the work that's continuing on recently and into the future, we've been working with NABS on multiple events. We worked with the Department of Interior, where Deb Howling came and did a public hearing for boarding school survivors in 2022. Now it's almost 3 years later. It's amazing the time has gone this quickly. But Deb came here to little tiny town in northern Michigan, Pellston, in summer. And for one day, people came from all over and told their stories. And it was a very, very difficult, empowering, sad, charged, all of it day of 7 hours, 8 hours, where boarding school survivors came forward and told their stories. And that's the first time I've ever heard that many stories at once. And it was completely overwhelming. And these transcripts are now made available through the Department of Interior. They're public knowledge, but they're difficult to read. So just putting that out there. You know, these are people's, in one of these stories, this woman she said she hadn't told the story in 70 years, what happened to her. And that says a lot. And some people talk for 2 minutes, some talk for 20. Some talk for 5, some would go into a great deal, some wouldn't. But without a doubt, these are all real stories of what happened to them. And the fact that, you know, Deb came here was quite the thing. You know, she's a rock star. And when she was here, everybody's like, oh my God, there's Deb Holland. And then all of a sudden, like, that's just part of the story here today. You know, we have this gymnasium filled with hundreds of people. And a lot of them were non-native, which is good. They need to hear this about their community. And I had some people come up to me afterwards, like, Eric, I would have never known. Like, none of us would have known unless these survivors came forward and told their story. So that was 3 years ago now, the road to healing. And then we had in 23, MSNBC or NBC Nightly News came to Harbor Springs and interviewed 2 survivors and myself for NBC Nightly News. And that was surreal to have Lester Holt send his team up north. And I got this phone call one day, and it was a 202 number. It's DC, so I probably should take this. Probably important. And it was this Sioux tribe. Sioux tribers are everywhere. Let me tell you. I mean, they're just. And it was this woman, Megan, and she's like, "Hey, I'm Ojibwe. I'm from Sault Ste. Marie. I'm an intern at NBC Nightly News, and we are doing this piece on boarding schools, and we want to focus just on early childhood. What do you say, Eric?" I'm like, Megan, you're hitting me with a lot right now. Let me talk to my boss about all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, go for it. You know, just do it right. And I'm like, no doubt. This is national news. And so I contacted Megan back and said, we're a go. What do you need from us? She goes, I need some survivors to go on camera. I'm like, that's kind of a tall order, Megan, but I think I got some people who can do this. And I went to Yvonne Walker-Kijik and Fred Kiogama. And before I could get done asking, they said, yes, this is our story. We need to tell our story from our voice. And so NBC Nightly News sent their team. They came in, and for 2 full days, they interviewed Yvonne, Fred, and myself. And Yvonne, this is Yvonne in the photo, obviously. And I've known Yvonne my whole life. I consider her, you know, she's one of my elders, auntie. She's one of the most phenomenal human beings I've ever met. And I didn't know the whole story of her Holy Child. I never asked. It's not my place, right? She talked for 4 hours straight about her experience. And it's a tough experience. It's not easy to hear. And I said, Yvonne, where do you want to do this? She goes, we'll do it downtown. That's where the story happened. I'm like, oh. So she talked about this right in front of the church for 4 hours. And not a dry eye, you know, and that was her story. Next day we interviewed myself. I'm just filler. Like, this is an archives. This is what we do. But it's kind of cool. I get to flex the archives I work at on national TV, but I wanted to show my contribution, you know, what created the system, the records, and what so on and so forth. Then we interviewed Fred, and he talked for 4 hours straight. And his story is really tough, just like Yvonne's. Again, not a dry eye. But at the end, both him and Yvonne said, this won't define us. We move forward, but we need to have people know what happened. Some people didn't make it out, large amount of substance abuse, suicides, kids passing out the schools, but some of us made it out and we go forward. It doesn't define us. I mean, hugely empowering to hear this from, you know, these people you know your whole life, but you don't know that part of them. So that was part of the experience. And we use this clip, this story. It's a 20-minute story now on YouTube in all kinds of environments, classrooms, museums. It's a really powerful learning tool to capture these 2 elders in this time and place about their experiences. Then NABS came. And they came last year and worked with Lacey and Charlie and the team. Say, hey, we want to, continue the work. And so we said, absolutely. What can we do to support? And so we worked together on collecting more people's testimonies, stories, experiences, and an oral history project last September. And they were here for a whole week. It wasn't just a day, it was a week. And we interviewed, 30 plus people. And they were full days. I mean, we're putting in 10, 12-hour days of giving people time and seeing how it's done professionally. And I'm a historian. I don't know how to interview people without harming them. And this was some humble pies. Like I thought I'm a pretty good historian. I can interview people. I'm not prepared for this. I don't know how to do this type of work. And then to see people who are well versed into it, it's like you take a step back and let them do this portion of it and just support when you can and how you can. It's a team effort. And we interviewed, and it was just one of those events, one of those experiences. It's just really will stay with you to have people from all over the country who are dealing with the same thing, but they're in your backyard, your community, and you're showing hospitality and working together for this common cause. And Native people get on each other about a lot of things, but to have us all come together and say, we need to get through this together, that was really, really impactful in a good way. So we had all the NABS team here for a week collecting, and that's moving forward. So I don't want to end on a negative note. We're ending on a power, place of power and resiliency. The fact that like our tribe has a language department says that the school didn't work to its fullest. We have a language department within our tribe. There's Native spirituality identity that's coming, in full force. People are naming their kids in Native language on their birth certificate. People are coming out and dressing in Native clothes and so on and so forth. And doing this where this school stood says quite a bit. The repatriation of children back to the tribal communities, not just at Carlisle, other schools are doing this. The survivors coming forward, sharing their stories. The investigation from the DOI. There's 2 reports from this investigation that I always recommend for people to use when, getting a baseline for their understanding of the school. And then NABS, what they're doing. So referring them to NABS, like this is the group that's doing the work. Has been and is doing it and will do it in the future. So go to them first. They have materials for education, just hard data and, things like today. So I'm always, putting in the plug for the NABS team. And then just doing the work within our own communities of collecting info. We are doing exhibits, we build curriculums, we do programs. I said the media, publications are coming, but first and foremost, survivors first. I want to end on that note. It's survivors first. They're the main focus of all of this. And again, I didn't go to this place. My mom didn't go, my grandma didn't go, but people I'm very near and dear with did go. And even if I'm not near and dear with them, that doesn't matter. I got to respect their experience. And this is experience that's happened all over Turtle Island, from Canada to here and other parts of the world as well, with this, horrible phenomenon of children being taken. And to me, this is just removal 2.0. You had Indian removal in the 1830s and 40s, where it's going to push you out west. But then in the 19th century into the 20th century, removal is still going on. They're just going into homes and taking kids and extracting them through, that way. But we're still here, not going anywhere. So with that, I probably ran over time. Charlie, Lacey, I get a little wordy, but I'll stop sharing. And that's that.
It's hard not to get very wordy when you're talking about this subject and to kind of keep it in within a time frame. So thank you so much, Eric. I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of people learned a lot on this call. And thank you to everybody that shared their own personal history in the chat. It was a little heart-wrenching to hear about families that were in photos or families that attended the schools or passed away there. So our hearts are with you as NABS. We do this work for you and with you as our center. We just have a couple questions, Eric, that we wanted to ask, and there's some in the chat. We are going to run over just a little bit, so bear with us, and then there's going to be a raffle. So if you can please stay on, we should be done within the next 10, 15 minutes or so. The first question, and I'll probably answer part of it as NABS, and then if you can add on, Eric. The first question is, I've been wanting to, for many years, see if a relative was at one of the schools, but I don't know their Chippewa name. What's the best way to figure this out? Or are there school records I can look through from the Michigan schools? So this reminds me of our, as NABS, we have a National Indian Boarding School Digital Archive. We call it NIBSDA. And there are some indexes on there that you can search names. And then from there, it can kind of guide you to contact National Archives to get copies of those records. Our NIBSDA is a forever project where we are continuously adding. We have a digital archives team that goes to National Archives and digitizes records. But right now there are some indexes on there for Michigan. And that's personally where I learned where some of my family went to Mount Pleasant. And I did not know that. My grandma's siblings all went to Mount Pleasant. So I would start there. Deidre just put the link in there. And then on our website, if you have any questions, you can reach out through there. And our digital archives manager and team can help guide you through the best way to find those records. Because once you find those records, you really start putting pieces together on what happened to your family. And with knowledge comes healing. So do you have any other suggestions, Eric, on where they should look?
I mean, no, your resources are better than pretty much anybody's right now. So I would, suggest, just go into the NABS information.
Awesome. Oh, did we lose Charlie? I know there are, no, okay.
Okay.
I know there's power issues with the wind and all that in Michigan right now, so.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I've got a few questions. I know we're close to time. So one of my questions, let's see, is we answered that one. Let's see. So one of my questions for you, Eric, is why do you think it's important to center boarding school survivor stories? I know you spoke to that towards the end and talked about survivors first. So can you share a little bit more about why you feel that way?
Well, I feel this way because it's such a personal, it's a human thing, that these people went through this, and these are people that we have in our communities, and they're the living example of the system, and they are the living story, they're the living evidence to this happening, and so much of their experiences have been negative, and it's just a lot of it's horrific. I don't want to go too much into the experiences because that's their story, and what I'm finding is there's this weird human nature thing to go towards the trauma and just get drawn into the worst part of the story, and that becomes the only part of the story, and then you fixate on it, and it's just you're perpetually the victim in all of this. And I think if people are telling their own stories, that alleviates some of that, and also that we're still finding this out to this present day. And I've had people compare this, and I don't disagree, completely. We talk about Holocaust survivors, it was so important to get their version of the story because they lived it. We read about it, we see the photos, but they had a whole level that we'll never understand by living through this. So I think there is some merit to that comparison because a lot of kids never made it back. A lot of kids are still, under these schools, or when they did make it out, they had such horrific experiences that they pass it on their communities. This intergenerational trauma, this is what they know, so they give it to their kids. So I want to respect the people who went through this, but then also their families and communities who are dealing with the direct repercussions of it. And so that's my take on it.
Yeah.
And that also, these are my neighbors, these are people I see every day, going to get coffee, or I see them in the tribal building, and it's just, sometimes I step back, I can't believe you went through that, but I don't want that to make my whole thing about you. You know, you're a whole person, you know. I don't want this to be like, oh, boarding school survivor, that's it. You know, and that's
Yeah.
not going to define you, but it's still, I have to sometimes check myself, like, I can't believe you went through that and you're walking down the hallways whistling and, you know, life's okay,
Yeah.
you know, it's like you're making it through. So
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate you mentioning that, you know, everybody's a whole person. There's more to the story than just, you know, being identified as a boarding school survivor. There's so much more to a person than that. So, thank you. One more question from me, and then I'll pass it back to Lacey. One of our participants asked in the chat, wouldn't section 106 kick in because of the remains that were found that you were called down to because there was federal funding when doing the road work,
I
or
don't, I don't know if there was federal funding or not.
Hmm.
NAGPRA could have kicked in, Section 106 could have kicked in. But the fact that you find a body and no police were called, that's step one. You know, regardless of Section 106, NAGPRA, anything, you know, this is missing person. You find one body, you find 24, you stop everything. You got to investigate this. So there's a lot of failure from that one day. And when we went down there to take care of this, you know, it started with me and about 5 other people. Within an hour, it was me and one other person. And I get it, you know, I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to recover kids out of a road and dirt pile and have to rebury them. But we did, we had to. And the fact that there was just nothing, no compassion, no humanity, no empathy from, you know, your community, you know, people around you. And then I just thought, there's 400 other schools. You know, this isn't going to be the one-off. So having, you know, our story get out there is to be the example of what not to do, and, you know, building some type of relationship that with your community. So when this happens, you know, there's a plan in place.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. You mentioned over 400 schools, and I know that's what the Department of the Interior put in their Volume 1 and then Volume 2 investigative report for the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. Not sure if everybody knows this, but NABS actually helped them start that list. They came to us a little bit over a few years now, and we're like, where do we begin? Well, we've been doing this for over 10 years, so through a memorandum of understanding and a long list of contributors to our list, we are now at over 526 Indian boarding schools in this country. Somebody will put the link to the chat in there. And as Eric was talking, like, this research is never ending. We still find new schools or still find new information on the schools. So we're still continuing to do research every day, finding the records every day. There are a couple questions in here I just want to address. Will any of the recent funding cuts impact accessibility to your resources? We were recently notified that we did lose funding through the NEH that did fund our digital archives program. Close to $300,000 was cut unexpectedly, immediately. So we are working to look for funding to continue this work, which is scanning and digitizing our records and going to the National Archives to add to our digital archives. So yes and no. It may pause the work a little bit, but we have a great team. Our CEO is hard, working really hard, and Deputy CEO to find funding sources through private funding foundations and tribes and orgs to help fund this work. So yeah, it won't impact accessibility right now, but it may just slow things down a little bit. When are we coming to Oregon for interviews? We are coming to Oregon in August for the oral history project, towards the end of the month. So be on the lookout for that. they're asking if this recording will be available. It will be available on our YouTube within the next week or so. An email will be sent out to those who registered for this. And then there was a question on here for you, Eric, and then we'll just do one more and then we'll do the raffle. Are you aware of any efforts being put to create a historical mile marker for Holy Childhood? I'm not reading it exactly, but I thought I saw that in there.
So this has been a topic of conversation for years at this point. And so I've been doing this lesson plan on boarding schools with our local high school for years at this point. And every single year I do this with our 9th grade, one of the students says, "Why isn't there a sign down there?" I'm like, good question. I mean, that's fair. There should be a sign. So it comes up all the time. Some students, native and non-native, have tried to initiate an effort to get a sign erected, but it runs into where we put it. We have to have permission from the property owner. I don't think the Catholic Church is going to let us do that right at this point. Maybe across the street, the city will allow us to put a historic marker in that would be directly where the school stood. But long story short, I definitely want to see something up at some point that would at least notify the public that this place was here. How we go about that, I don't know yet. We have to get some pieces worked out within our community, not just the native community, but the city of Harbor Springs, funding to find this, get the sign built. But I think it will happen eventually. It's a very sensitive thing here in our own town, native and non-native. So we got to be, thinking 10 steps ahead on how it's gonna affect the community, native and non-native. It's not our property, so we have to get permission. We have to do some fundraising, which I wouldn't think be a problem whatsoever. But every single word will be scrutinized over and over of what we put on that. And again, I don't want to focus on the trauma and so on and so forth, but I think just notifying people that this is there. And if you've never been to Harbor Springs, it's a different place. In the summer, a lot of resorters, a lot of, big fancy resort homes are there. So it's got a personality. And when I did this program a couple years ago, this is the exact same program that I just rolled out today for the town of Harbor Springs for the museum. We had 270 people show up, and 269 of them were non-native. So one native person showed up, great. Everybody else is non-native, which is good. You want people to know. And you could hear a pin drop. Like they weren't ready for that story. And they're like, okay, what do we do? I don't know about this. And so we have a lot of work to do. And like I said, we want to get this up. And real quick, Lacey, we had a grant through NEH that was appropriated. We had the funds from last year to do an exhibit on art experience. We were going to do 40 panels. And we got the same letter you probably got a couple months ago or a month ago saying this doesn't fit the president's agenda. All your money's been pulled. But like you, we're not stopping. We've already got another funding source lined up. We're going to apply for a grant through the state of Michigan and get this out. You don't stop the work.
Right. Yep. They can try, but they're not going to be successful, just like the boarding schools, So appreciate that. We could talk all day long on this topic. So thank you to everybody who stayed on.
Yep.
We're going to move into the raffle, and there is going to be pictures on the screen of what some prizes look like. And we have combined them into 3 packages. And Charlie, do you want to name the first one? First winner?
Sure.
We had our team on the background do a shuffle of all the people online. So
Okay. And I just want to remind everybody too, if there are questions that you have that went unanswered today, please feel free to share them to info@nabshc.org. And we'll be happy to filter them to the right person to answer or address those questions, if we can. So just know that we want to stay here longer to chit chat and share more about this, because we can talk all day about this. So again, that's info@nabshc.org. So our first winner today is Robert or Bobby Hazen.
So he'll win the first package. Congrats. We know Bobby Hazen. He's a friend of NABS. Awesome. The next one is Patsy Whitefoot. Is Patsy still on? I think so. Patsy is the second place. Way to go, Patsy. We love Patsy.
And our
And-
final winner, our final winner is Karen Wasagijic, who we also are family at NABS. So congrats, Karen, and congrats, Bobby and Patsy.
Patsy is a former NABS board member, is what is in the chat. Yes, I believe Patsy is actually one of the founders too of NABS. So thanks for joining.
All right, and I see a question in the chat too. How can we purchase any of these items? So I just want to say that I believe, and Deidre can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're going to send a follow-up email to those that have attended today, and we can put that information in the email. Or again, if you do want to reach out to us at NABS, info@nabshc.org, and we can definitely connect you to the right person. But I want to thank everybody for attending today. It's been a great presentation, and thank you so much, Eric. We have some really great comments in the chat box, and you're just a wealth of knowledge and such a grounded person doing this work. So thank you so much. And I just the last thing I want to share or say is make sure that we're all doing, self-care and taking care of ourselves when doing this research and learning about the boarding school legacy and the boarding school era. It's really important that we take some time to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves as we learn this information, because it can be very hard and arduous sometimes. So I just want to leave with that, and see if Deidre wants to come on or anybody else wants to come on and say goodbye. But that's all I've got for now. So Chimigwech, everybody. Chimigwech Kinawea.
Miigwech, Bama P, everybody.
Bama Pigigwamin.